We rotationally graze our cows on our back field, and each year the flies get awful. Which is why the Joel Salatin Eggmobile concept of your chickens following behind your cows on pasture to mimic nature and clean up the fly larvae in the cow pies has always made so much sense. Until recently, we never had a tractor or anything we could pull a structure with that was big enough to fit the 50 or so laying hens we keep around our homestead. So initially, we built a coop in our barn and let our laying hens free range around our property. Well, after a few years, our lawn is almost entirely scratched away. We can never plant anything in pots or outside of our fenced-off garden spaces. The coop in our barn has been a constant magnet for rodents and every kind of bird you can imagine taking up residence. And the chicken poop. It's everywhere. Our patio, where our kids play, and almost always on the bottom of our shoes. Something needed to change. Last year, we got a small tractor, step 1. Now we could pull a sizable mobile structure. Step 2, time. We set aside this spring to build the best darn Eggmobile we could dream up. Something that looked good, was functional, and would last. Step 3, finalizing a design. I searched for design inspiration far and wide and pulled together all the best features from the different Eggmobile chicken coops I came across. Lastly, step 4, cost and then tracking down all the right materials. It took a month, but we have a working Eggmobile and it turned out way more awesome than we could have imagined. We'll show you the full build, what thought went behind the design, and if you stick around to the end, we'll break down what it all cost. Alright, so it's been a really long day here and we finally wrapped up, after like a month or so, we finally wrapped up our chicken coop that you can see in the background there. And it's time for what I am calling Operation Egg Drop Soup. So we're gonna gather up, I got my chicken wrangler team here with me, and we're gonna gather up, we got all our laying hens there in the background in the barn coop, and then we got a bunch of chicks in the brooder that we're gonna bring them all together and egg drop soup it. So let's bring it in, guys. Hands in on 3. Egg drop soup on 3. 1, 2, 3. Egg drop soup! All right, let's do it, guys.
Here we go.
We're gonna figure this out. Try a few at a time. All right, here we go. Got one. All right. Let's do this quick. Got one. 2. 3.
Oh, chaos! Chickens are flying.
All right. Door's open already, so we're gonna have to do a similar thing. Just grab them out one at a time. You kind of slide it. All right, in you go. Whew. Yep. In you go. One more still.
There. Got some chickens in there.
In you go. All right. Close them up. Round 2. Rooster. I got you, babe.
You're okay, Greatheart.
You're okay. We got you. Ladies.
Finally, we got a rooster.
You got it. You go first, Betty.
Go home, guys. You'll like it.
That's what they do. One more. All right. So those are up.
Let's get that skateboard first.
Yeah. All right, open.
Alexis got these skateboards.
Got her. All right.
We got this
Whoa.
rooster. Give Daddy a workout chicken. Give up.
It's right over here. It's underneath.
Heavy load. The roosters weigh a lot. Rooster in.
I got both of them.
I don't think we're gonna have many eggs for a couple days.
Yeah, I gave away like all of our eggs. That's okay.
All right. All right. One last chicken load and then onto the chicks. You guys get in here.
Got it.
All right, put them in. Put 'em in. We're gonna put all of them in here.
Trigger.
In one fell swoop.
One fell swoop. They're not that big.
How small?
Got cinnamon. All right.
2 more. Done.
All right. Close them up.
Everybody really wash your hands because I got chickens on mine.
Yeah.
Hey, Mom, I got one.
Awesome, buddy.
Two black ones. So I think they're black.
All right, guys.
The only one who's being curious.
Operation Egg Drop Soup completed. All right. High fives. Boom. Boom. Boom.
Way to take much time.
Boom. All right,
Time
guys.
to get the last chicken now.
Good work. Let's go see if we can wrangle up that last one.
I'm gonna
So our chickens have gotten settled into our new mobile chicken coop or Eggmobile for the last couple days now. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a little tour of what we have going on. So the footprint of it is 8 foot by 12 foot. And we have right now around 60 to 70 chickens total in there. We had about 30 to 40 older egg layers, and then we added 30 or so new egg laying chicks in there with them. I think it could hold up to around 100 chickens comfortably, but I'm really happy with that 8 foot by 12 foot scale of it. I think it's just the right size for what we have going on here. So the first part of these mobile coop setups is the base or foundation underneath with the wheels, which is called a running gear, or it could also be like a hay wagon or something like that. Essentially, it's a big farm trailer that you could build anything on top of. I found a really awesome used running gear locally off of Facebook Marketplace, picked that up, and it worked out perfectly. And once we get more into the build, I'll share some more of the things that I learned about these running gears, because there are a lot of different options out there, and you definitely want to make sure that you get the right one when you're building a chicken coop on top of it. So just for a really basic breakdown of the materials that I just used standard 2x4 framing construction to build it, and then for the siding on the outside I used the Pro Rib steel sheets for the upper siding, and I also used that on the roof. And then the lower siding that I used is actually oak fence panels. So we did a big fencing project around our barn last fall, and I used these 16-foot oak boards for that, and I just fell in love with this wood. It stands up really well to the elements, and so I thought those oak boards would be a really good candidate to use for our chicken coop here too, and I really like how they turned out. So I used them around the base of the coop, and then also to trim out the windows and panels and doors and things like that. So a couple of other things that we wanted to make sure that we have plenty of inside the coop was sunlight and then airflow. And so for windows, another one of my sweet Facebook Marketplace finds was these old vintage kind of 6-pane windows, and I installed those. They're just fixed, they don't open, but below that is where we have some panels that we built in, 2 on each side, and those are our air vent panels. And so we can open those up. There's a little kickstand. Actually, let me just give you a little demonstration. So just fold up the kickstand and they close right up and latch. But those are really awesome to kind of control the temperature and the airflow inside there. If it's a cool night, I can close those and shut them to trap in some heat. And on a warm, sunny day like this, I open those up and there's lots of airflow going through the coop. One of my favorite features of our chicken coop is this solar-powered automatic chicken door from Chick Cozy. I am a big fan of anything that can be automated when it comes to animal chores, and having a door that opens and closes on its own is a feature that totally makes sense. It also has this super easy to use solar-powered control panel that allows you to either manually open and close the door, or you can set it to open and close at specific times, or my personal favorite is that it has a built-in light sensor that you can dial in so that it opens with the sunrise and then closes with the sunset, which is perfect for allowing it to automatically adjust with the seasons. We used to spend a bunch of time in the evenings wrangling up the chickens to get them closed up in the coop at night, and I'm not always outside first thing at the crack of dawn every morning to open up the coop and let them out. And so this door basically allows them to close themselves up every night, and then they also appreciate the extra time to get out early in the mornings and range around. This door is solid. When it closes, it latches up tight, and it's thick enough to keep out predators both big and small. We've been impressed with how smoothly the dual motor design works to open and close the door, and there's no need for extra batteries since the solar panel keeps it going constantly. Pretty slick. And probably my favorite thing about it is how easy it is to install. Where literally everything else on this project took at least double the time that I had budgeted, this chicken door was the exact opposite. I set aside about an hour and it took roughly half that time. It's perfect to put on any new chicken coop build, or it can easily be retrofitted onto just about any existing coop. If you want to simplify your chicken chores and also rest assured that your gals are locked up safe at night even when you're out for the evening, check out our link below, and Chick Cozy is also offering our audience 5% off when you use code FROMSCRATCH. So going along with our automatic chicken door is this chicken ramp that we built. The kids actually helped me put this together. It's built with some of the extra oak pieces that we had from the project. And so with these mobile chicken coops, they end up being a couple feet off the ground. And so you need something for your chickens to get up and down to have access to the coop. So we built a ramp. It's detachable because when you're moving the coop, obviously you don't want something fixed on there or it's going to break. And so I basically just put this little end piece on that slides. It's kind of like a tongue, and built a box right under our automatic chicken door, and this just slides right in, locks in place so it's secure. And then I also put some little wooden cleats. I used kind of the underbody, that running gear frame of the chicken coop underneath the chicken coop, and put some little wooden cleats where I can actually take this off, slide it right in there for when we're removing the coop, and it will get tucked away under there, and then I can just pull it right back out and put it back on whenever we get it in its new resting spot. So before we head inside the coop, I just wanted to talk really quick about the front door of our chicken coop that I built. And I'm actually really proud of how this door turned out. If you've ever worked with installing doors or building doors, you know that they can be pretty tricky to get right with the sizing and fit and opening and closing and all those sorts of things. But this door thankfully turned out great. It works as smooth as can be, and it turned out way better than I expected. So on the outside, I just have your pretty standard barrel lock that can lock it up secure from the outside. I also put in one of those little pin latches on the inside of the coop, because there's times where you want to be in the coop working in there doing something and all the chickens are in there and you don't necessarily want them getting out, so that you can lock it from the inside in those instances. And then I also put, just like I did with all the air vent panels on the side, I put some foam weather stripping all around the sides of the door, so when it closes up nice and tight and it's secure, it doesn't rattle, and it's also weather tight, so that if we want to keep our chickens in here in the winter, it should be sealed up really well from the weather and the cold. So that's our door. I'm gonna head in now. All right, so inside the coop, really what takes up most of the space in here are the roosting bars. And so I did 2 kind of ladder style roosting bars on each side of the coop, and they basically just kind of make a V inward. But yeah, they're pretty basic. I used 2x4s and put the 2x4s horizontally. We did a roost like this in our barn chicken coop previously. The chickens seem to appreciate it, and I think there's some benefits to, especially in the winter time with the 2x4 roosts. They can protect their feet better when they're roosting up here at night and it's really cold. So we stuck with that, but that's basically our roosts. They're pretty standard. And then the roosts kind of lead down into this center plank that really like 90-95% of the foot traffic in this coop is going to be on. And so this is just a 2x10 that I bolted down here really good. And yeah, you can see it's covered in chicken poop. The rest of the floor of the coop is actually 1 inch by 1 inch hardware cloth. And that was actually one of the things that I looked into the most when kind of thinking of the design of doing an Eggmobile, was what the floor was going to be. Because I've talked to some other friends and farmers and people who have built these before, and if you don't get the flooring right, it can make your life a nightmare with poop buildup all throughout the coop and it not working like it should, because a big part of how these are designed is that the poop from the chickens just goes right through the floor and fertilizes your pasture or wherever you have them as you go. But if you have too small of an opening of the floor, the poop's not going to fall through, it's going to cake up, it's going to get really nasty. So I ended up going with 1 inch by 1 inch hardware cloth. So far it's seeming pretty good. We'll see with time. Time will tell if that's going to be the right thing to go with or not. A lot of people use what's called expanded metal sheets, which is kind of that like diamond shape metal sheeting you see on the bottom of a lot of things, trailers, whatnot. So I opted not to go with that. I had a friend who used that and he said that it was bad news, that didn't work, and the poop kept getting caked up on there. So so far 1 inch by 1 inch hardware cloth seems to be working okay. It's not great for foot traffic. I wouldn't walk directly on there, but if you step on the 2x4 joists that are below it, it's fine. If kids step on it, it's fine, but it really can't support the weight of a full-grown adult yet. But this plank right here down the middle is going to handle really all or most of the traffic inside the coop. So another feature that I'm really excited about inside our coop are the laying boxes or nesting boxes that we picked up from Hen Gear. And so this is a roll-out nesting box design. And so what that means is the chickens hop in here, lay their eggs, and then there's a collection box in the front here where you actually lift. There's a roosting bar. So you lift up the roosting bar and then you can pull this front panel open, and all the eggs just roll right down into this collection area here. And what's nice about that is that the eggs stay really clean, and they don't get pecked at, they don't get stepped on, they just roll right down after a chicken lays them. And so it makes collecting eggs really easy. I think it's going to be awesome for our kids who have been chasing eggs all around our chicken coop in our barn, trying to find them everywhere. So far the chickens have picked up on this really well. Most of them are laying in here. There's a few that are laying around the yard, outside the coop, or in different places around the coop. But so far most have picked up really easily to start laying in here. It's worked out really great so far. The eggs are awesome and clean and easy to collect. And this thing is just built solidly. It was easy to assemble. It's really easy to clean out when it needs to be cleaned out. It's nice to have this roosting bar that folds up and down, so in the evening when we close them up and do chores, we can put this up, and then in the morning we can put it back down so they can get access back in there again, but not necessarily spend the whole night roosting on here and pooping and making a mess on the laying boxes. So it's got some really awesome features. This is the extra large model. It's the biggest one that they make. I think it holds, or it works with up to 75 chickens. And there we go. I think this is the right size for our setup, and so far I've really liked it. I will mention that this box, the collection box, can actually be reversed so that you can collect eggs from the outside of the coop. We opted to do it on the inside for a number of different reasons, but I think that's the right move for us right now. But you could also reverse this, and then you can just collect all your eggs from outside the coop, which I think would work really well for a lot of setups. And last but not least are our feeders and waterers inside the coop. I really just have one of each right now. This is the feeder here, and then the water that we had from our previous coop. I just brought them over, parked them in here, and it's kind of a good spot to have them up in the front for easy access. But I'm not in love with either one of these designs. The feeder especially, the chickens get in there and kick it all around, and there's always food everywhere. So if anybody has any suggestions or feeders, waterers that they're in love with and could recommend, I'm all ears. I'd love to find a better setup here for the future with those. So that's really the tour of the chicken coop. So it started out as me just sitting down about a month ago, sketching out some basic design details of what I kind of imagined the coop was going to be like. And here it is, and it's built, and it's actually even better than I imagined it would turn out. And so I'm super happy with it. I think the chickens are liking it so far. Now we just need to figure out how to get it kind of rotating behind our cows, and there's going to be some logistics to figure out there, but I think it's going to work out pretty well for us. Once you start looking into the world of running gears, there are literally hundreds of different designs and options to choose from. They're basically just four-wheel farm trailers that serve all sorts of purposes on farms. The one I got is a Parker, which is made in Indiana, and I'm pretty sure it's a 10-ton running gear. You'll often find hay wagons, which are just running gears with a platform built on top, and sometimes they have a cage for holding hay bales too. These are fine options to go with, but if you plan to have an open floor design like the one that I built where the poop falls through, then just a running gear is really all you need. If you get a hay wagon, you'll likely just be stripping off all the wood and starting from scratch anyways. Running gears come in lots of different sizes and weight capacities. Most are designed to handle an 8-foot wide deck, but there are smaller gears out there that would work for a smaller, lighter weight coop setup too. They all have a ton rating for their weight capacity. You'll see anywhere from a couple of tons up to 14 plus tons. Most that I saw fell in the 8, 10, 12 ton rating category. The other thing that I was surprised to learn about running gears is that the length is actually adjustable on most of them. So the center tube or spine of them actually has multiple settings where you can unscrew the bolt holding it together, and then you can typically make them shorter or longer to fit your needs. Mine came at about 10 feet long, but I wanted it closer to 12 feet for the 12-foot long coop that I planned to build. So when I tried unbolting the front side bolt, it was totally seized up and giving me a heck of a time trying to get it loose. But thankfully then I tried the back bolt, which came loose fairly easily, and I was able to extend the wheelbase about an extra 18 inches, which made it the perfect length. One of the biggest things you'll want to consider when picking up a running gear is tires. Many have older tires that are starting to wear out or dry rot. Now, these implement tires can generally last a long time even after they've started dry rotting, but I also learned that each one can be in the $150 to $200 range to replace per tire. The other thing you'll often come across is people putting truck tires on running gears, which is a fine option. Just be aware that replacing tires can be costly, so you may want to hold out for one that has tires that are in good shape. I was thrilled that the tires on the one I found were in excellent shape, and the guy I bought it from said that the rims had also been replaced relatively recently, so I'm hoping ours should last a good long while. I wanted to find a spot to build this thing that was as flat as can be. You can put the running gear up on blocks and use shims and whatnot to get it perfectly level, but I just maneuvered it a bit until it was as level as I could get it and figured it would be good enough. The last thing I'll mention with running gears is to make sure the front axle turns freely and to give the steel tongue that pulls it and the frame a good look and make sure that things aren't too bent up and are relatively straight. It was also super nice that this flat spot is where we had just recently run power out to, which made it ideal for building, but I also realized that this spot would be a good candidate for where we can park this thing in the fall to set up fencing around and keep our chickens here over the winter, since we had also set up a fencer here and then there's power right there to keep water from freezing. Really, the first thing you need to do is determine the size of chicken coop you want. That is going to determine what size of trailer or running gear you need, and then you can start coming up with the rest of your coop design from there. The biggest Eggmobiles I've seen out there are 16 feet long and 8 feet wide. I considered this since those are actually the dimensions of our barn coop that we currently had our chickens in, but when I imagined something of that scale being mobile, it just seemed too massive. I still wanted it to be big enough to comfortably house between 50 and maybe even 100 chickens, and so after playing around with the sizing a bit and looking at some other Eggmobiles, I landed on 12 feet long and 8 feet wide, and I'm really happy I did. That feels like the right size, both inside and out, to fit everything and everyone comfortably and be a manageable size for our few acres. From there, you can start playing around with the design and style of your coop. Where do you want windows and doors? What about airflow and vents? Where will the laying or nesting boxes go? Roosting bars, food, water, etc. Since chores happen every day, it's worth taking some extra time to think it all through to make everything as efficient as possible. Some of those details can be figured out and finalized as you're building it, but the biggest thing is getting the right size and scale for your setup. To start building on top of the running gear, I needed to install some long runners or beams that the coop would sit on top of. Now, I wish I had taken some measurements of my running gear before I went and picked up all the materials. I planned for sistering two 12-foot treated 2x6s together for those runners. But when I sized up how those would fit on the running gear, I realized the platform or base of the coop wouldn't sit high enough to clear the wheels of the gear since the coop actually overhangs the wheels. Getting 2x8s instead of 2x6s would have been the simple solution, but to work with what I had, I used a couple treated 2x4s to sit on the running gear and lift up the 2x6 beams. The downside to this is that the running gear has 4 90-degree steel brackets, one at each corner, for bolting the beam to. Each bracket has 2 holes that could fit 2 half-inch bolts through, which I plan to use to strap on the 2x6 runners. But once I lifted those runners up to clear the wheels, I was only able to utilize 1 bolt hole and bolt at each bracket. They still strapped in tight and secure. But again, this could have all been much more ideal if I had taken some basic measurements of the running gear ahead of time and planned that out better. The brackets and mounting options are unique for all running gears, so you'll definitely need to adapt the design of those runners accordingly. But I would definitely at least go with double 2x6s since there's a lot of weight on top. I've even seen some opt to weld steel beams below to build on. The base or platform I built was just 2x4s spaced every 16 inches on center, and I made that a true 12 feet long by 8 feet wide. I did use treated 2x4s for the outside boards, but the inside joists were just standard 2x4s. I was questioning this later if I should have used treated wood for the whole underside platform, but I think the standard wood should hold up fine still since it won't be directly exposed to the elements, just lots of chicken poop. To fasten that platform framing to the beams or runners below, I picked up 10 or so metal brackets that I screwed in on every second or third joist to really hold it on there securely. Then the rest of the joists without the brackets I just sunk a couple screws into so the whole thing was secured down to the running gear. I did also opt to offset the base and really the whole coop so it wasn't centered on the running gear but offset it about a foot or so it overhangs a bit more in the back. I figured with that tongue in the front that pulls the trailer and then the axles and turning wheels in the front that you might want some extra space up there for moving and accessing things. I wasn't sure about this decision at first, but later on, once the whole thing was built, I realized that that was the right call. There are lots of grease fittings up front there that are easier to access this way, and then the tongue itself actually makes a really nice built-in ramp and platform for getting into the coop. I'll mention here too that I use screws for all of my framing. Just 3-inch star-bit coated screws that are rated for exterior use. Yes, nails would be faster, but I like the option of screws to really hold things together tight, but then also to be easily disassembled if needed. If you're wondering why an Eggmobile in the first place, or is a mobile chicken coop even worth it, I've thought about this long and hard, so here are some thoughts. 1, the whole concept of it is mimicking nature, which I am always for when it comes to farming and growing food. What always trails behind herding, grazing animals moving about in nature? Birds. Flies lay eggs in the fresh manure of animals that just grazed through an area, so it's a feeding frenzy for birds once those larvae hatch. This does 2 things. 1, it should cut down on the fly pressure for your grazing animals. And 2, it provides a steady source of quality protein and food for your chickens. So in theory, your feed costs should go down too during the grazing season months. Another benefit is the chickens scratching and spreading out the cow manure so it's not so concentrated. The chickens are also adding their own manure as they range about, and since the coop never stays in the same spot too long, there's no manure buildup like can happen in a fixed coop, which can be unhealthy both for your land and for your animals. Since we only graze a couple of cows across our back 3.5 acres, they can tend to get pretty picky and choosy with what they eat versus what they leave. The result is usually a decent amount of undergrowth buildup of dead grasses that suppress the pasture over time. My suspicion and hope is that the constant scratching and foraging of the chickens will help get rid of that undergrowth and alleviate the symptoms. And then one of my favorite parts of a mobile coop, it's mobile. You can take it with you anywhere. If you ever move, you don't have to start new. You can just bring the whole setup and chickens right with you. Framing the walls was a little tricky to figure out and definitely took some planning ahead. I started with the side walls and I wanted to make sure I got the height of these walls right. I was planning for a shed style slanted roof, so for the taller wall I landed on 7 feet 6 inches. 8 feet just was seeming too tall, so I shrunk it a hair. And then I wasn't sure on the shorter wall what height to make it. After going back and forth, I landed on 6 feet, so an 18-inch height differential between the two walls. I'm really happy this is where I landed. I felt the slope looked appropriate, and I was still able to fit in the doors and windows and everything how I wanted at those heights. Getting those walls up on the platform was a bit tricky. This is where I'm glad that I picked up a few extra longer 2x, which allowed me to do some diagonal cross braces to secure those walls in place, get them as level as possible, and then hold them level and square until I was able to wrap everything with plywood later. Once those walls were in place where I wanted them, I came through with some longer GRK structural screws and sunk those into the bottom plate of the wall every couple of feet so they were securely fastened to the bottom platform. Once the side walls were in place, then I could start figuring out the dimensions for the front and back walls. These were somewhat tricky to get the sizing right for with that slanted roof on top. Again, this is where I was really thankful to be working with screws and to be able to disassemble easily and make slight height adjustments with the saw along the way. You'll obviously need to frame out the openings for doors, windows, vent panels, etc. to your needs, but one thing I will mention is that I framed things with plenty of extra spacing and margin to fit in windows and whatnot. Since it's a chicken coop and a mobile one at that, I figured that things would torque and twist pretty well as it's being pulled, and I didn't want anything fitting too tightly. So where on a house you might allow for a 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch spacing in the framing, I was giving things a 1/2 inch to 1 inch and figured I could always fill in or shim things later if needed. The other thing worth mentioning is that anywhere there was a sill board, so at the bottom of windows or vent panels, I angled those sill boards a bit so that the water hitting those sills would drain toward the outside of the coop. Slid right in. Maybe we can just leave it and It could be a mobile jungle gym for you guys.
That would be fun.
My plan was to use 12-foot long metal panels for the roof, and I wanted it to be a standard size so I could just put the panels up there without any cutting. So I basically built the roof framing to be 12 foot wide by around 14 feet long, which would give about a 1-foot roof overhang on each side of the coop. I did shrink those framing dimensions down a few inches on each side. I planned to use oak boards as a fascia around the framing, so I removed 1 inch on each side for that, and then I removed another 2 inches or so from each side for the roof to overhang those oak boards a bit. I used 2x6s around the rim of the roof framing and then filled in with 2x4 rafters every 16 inches on center. I actually only installed a few of the 2x4 rafters initially because I knew it was going to get pretty heavy once it was all put together, and I wasn't sure how in the world we were going to get it up there. Normally I would have brought our tractor out and used the bucket to help hoist it up there, but I shared a few videos ago how I broke the back end of our tractor using a post hole auger, and it wasn't quite done yet in the shop with our friend who's working on it. Thankfully, after trying initially with a few different tactics that were unsuccessful, we were able to use some 2x4s to push the roof framing up there.
Go! Go, Daddy, go! Go, go, go! There! Yes!
No one died in the making of this chicken coop.
Come down again.
Oh man.
Once we got it as square as possible and in place where we wanted it, I sunk some screws in to hold it in place and then put the rest of the 2x4 rafters up. To fasten the roof securely to the framing, I picked up some of those metal hurricane straps and screwed them in at each roof rafter to the framing below. This might have been overkill, but when winds pick up, the roof can generally take the brunt of the force, and I wanted to be absolutely sure this thing was going to stay put. Alright, last one. The last thing I did with roof framing was add some blocking around the outside. I added a few blocks, mainly for support on the overhangs on the front and back sides of the coop, but then to both seal up the coop from weather and from predators, I also needed to cut and put 2x4 blocks on the top of the sidewalls between each roof rafter to fill in the few inch gap at those spots. Those are the little side tasks in a project like this that can be super time consuming and annoying, but also super necessary to keep your chickens safe and sealed up well. Next came wrapping all the framing, top and sides, in plywood. This was not something that I had to do. You could just put your siding and your roofing directly onto the framing, but one of the things I was considering with this coop was how best to seal it up tight for the winter time. I figured that a layer of plywood would help make it a lot more comfortable for the chickens when it gets cold. I was originally thinking I might even insulate the walls and the roof and then close off the walls from the inside with some sort of metal or tin, but I opted to not do this. I figured closing up the walls would become an easy target for mice and other insects to take up residence in the wall cavities. Plus, it's something that would be easy enough to do later if it seemed necessary. But for now, I figured the plywood would offer a little extra tightness and insulation for the coop on the whole. I just used 1/2 inch plywood and fastened it on with shorter screws. I started with the walls and then worked my way up to the roof. The plywood also acts to add a lot of lateral stability to the whole structure once it's screwed in good. At this point, we basically had a giant box on wheels, so the next day I set out to open everything back up again. To locate the doors and windows, I put a screw at each corner of the openings from the inside facing out. Then I used a chalk line and snapped a line where I'd be cutting for each opening. This is a perfect job for a smaller battery-powered circular saw. I just set the blade shallow and cut along each of the lines that I had traced out for the openings. I made sure to keep track of the cutouts for the door and vent panels because I would use that plywood as a backing for actually building those panels. Once all the openings were cut out, I set to work on putting together the basic framing and backing for the door and vent panels. On the back of the plywood, I built a basic frame of ripped in half 2x4s and screwed the plywood and wood frames together. Having some quick clamps on hand was really helpful for this process. I also made sure that the wood frames were at least 2 inches smaller than the dimensions of the panels that I was making. This would allow me to install jambs made out of 2x4s later around the framing of the panels that the plywood could close up tight to. Before I got too much further with the chicken coop itself, I knew I needed to do some finishing on the wood I'd be using to build the door and vent panels so that it had time to dry and cure before I needed to build and install those. My plan was to use those plywood panels that I had built, add a layer of car siding or tongue and groove boards onto that, and then trim out the car siding with the oak fence boards. Since the car siding is usually a pine or softwood that's more ideal for interior use, I knew I was going to need to seal it with something that would stand up to the elements. So I turned to one of my favorite companies and picked up some oils from Real Milk Paint Co. They're a super down-to-earth and transparent company with an awesome lineup of natural paints and finished products. We've already been using their dark half tung oil for years on our butcher block countertops in our kitchen and have loved the results. It leaves a beautiful dark tone and also seals the wood really well from water and constant use. Their other product I've been wanting to try for a while is their outdoor defense oil, and I figured this would be the perfect application. It's a mix of tung oil, pine oil, and zinc that's optimized for protecting wood in exterior applications. I still wanted to get a darker finish on the tongue and groove boards, so I started with applying 2 coats of the dark half tung oil first. One of the things I love about their oils is how easy they are to apply. Usually I just use an old rag or sock to wipe and spread it into the boards, but this was the first time I actually used a brush, and I think this is going to be my new go-to for applying it. It was easier than ever to apply. Now, that first coat can take a really long time. The raw wood soaks up a lot of the oil, and especially when you're doing these tongue and groove boards and you want to make sure that you get every little nook and cranny of the tongues and grooves and fronts and backs of the board, it just tends to go slow. But each coat after that typically goes much quicker. After 2 solid coats of the dark tung oil, I then applied 2 good coats of the outdoor defense oil on top of that. The beautiful thing about the 2 different types of oil is that they're completely compatible with each other. So often, different oils don't mix well, but so many of Real Milk Paint Co.'s finishes are compatible. I don't love painting things for outdoor use, but it also would have been sweet to paint these boards with some of their natural milk paint, and then you can apply the outdoor defense oil directly on top of that so that the color really locks in and lasts even when outside. Overall, I really love how the boards are looking after applying the outdoor defense oil. They're going to look really sharp once they're trimmed out with the oak. If there was one downside to the oil, And I think it had more to do with the early spring timing and applying the finish outside, but the oil was getting dive bombed by literally hundreds of little gnats as I was finishing them. I think it was the pine oil smell that they were drawn to, but I spent a good amount of time at the end pulling those darn bugs off of my boards. Annoying, but I think it also goes to show just how natural of a product it is. Now that the boards had 4 solid coats of oil applied to them, I brought them back inside to start drying and curing for a few days before installing them. Tung oil ideally needs 30 days to cure fully, but I figured they can finish curing after I get everything put together.
On that side?
I do, but not very well yet.
I'm gonna get to a point pretty soon where I can't breathe anymore. You good? I don't know.
Yeah. Getting the metal roofing panels on was the logical next step. There was nothing overly complex about this process. Overall, the panels went on pretty smoothly and fit just how I imagined that they would. But like most anything with this project, or most any major project, it just all takes way longer than you think it should. It seemed like you should just throw some panels up there, screw them down, and away you go. But getting the panels up there is a bit of a chore, and working that high off the ground and at funny angles, going up and down ladders, just slows everything down. The roof was a solid day-long project when I felt like it should have just taken a few hours. I know I always hear that you're actually supposed to install the rubber washer screws at the top of the ribs for a correct install. I've just never really understood that, so I still installed it along the flat part of the steel panels. Plus, I wanted to make sure the screws were actually sunk down into the roof rafters below, and the ribs really never lined up with the rafters. I did have my daughter as a spotter below, letting me know if the screws were staying in line with the roof rafters or not. That was super helpful since I was pretty much putting in screws blindly, and it's a little disorienting working sideways and at weird angles on the rooftop. I will say that heights are not my favorite, but thankfully that 18-inch differential on the sidewall heights for the shed roof also felt like a comfortable angle for working on top of up on the roof. As much as I wished this was the case, things didn't just pause on the rest of the homestead while the coop was being built. The biggest thing was that we were running low on our hay supply, and to stretch what we had and avoid picking up more, I needed to set up some fencing through our orchard area where the grass was growing in nicely so they could start grazing it down. This took a couple of hours, and it's a bit of a hassle weaving in and out of all of our fruit trees to keep those protected, but it was totally worth it. Yes, I had to pull away from the project, but it kept the cows happy and allowed us to utilize this pasture space instead of me just mowing it down later. We were finally at the finished stage of the coop itself, or maybe so we thought. I'll explain that in a moment. We started with the oak boards up on top as a fascia around the roof framing. Those went in great and looked great. My parents were here helping this day, and having a second set of hands getting those longer boards up was really helpful. Next was cutting and putting up the bottom horizontal oak boards. I had planned it for 4 boards or 2 feet high since they're typically a true 6-inch width. Again, having some clamps on hand, especially for when those boards were a little bent, was super helpful for getting those in and keeping them straight. Then I started ripping those oak boards in half with a table saw for 3-inch trim pieces and started trimming out the window and panel areas along with the door. All those oak boards and trim I fastened with these premium construction screws that I believe were from the Gripfast brand. Now, they weren't cheap, but some of the things I liked was 1, the gold color had a really nice finish look to them. They also worked really smoothly, even going into these hard oak boards. And they have that same feature where if you've ever used GRK screws before, they actually draw the boards you're screwing together so you get a super tight bond. Now what happened was that night I couldn't sleep. I had the thought of wrapping the plywood with some sort of water or moisture barrier before I started the siding, but for whatever reason I convinced myself it wasn't necessary since it was only a chicken coop. Then I realized what is actually keeping that plywood from getting wet and rotting out under the siding, and I knew something needed to be done. To be fair, I did plan to put plenty of flashing tape on the framing of the sills and jambs at the openings, but I realized to do this right, I really needed to pull down the boards we had just put up and properly wrap and tape the plywood first. So the next morning I went back to the hardware store to pick up the proper wrapping and supplies I needed. There's your standard house wrap or moisture barrier. For whatever reason, I was feeling like I wanted something extra around those boards at the base since they weren't tongue and groove and water could easily get behind them. There are those ice and water shields that are self-sealing, and I know they're typically for roofing applications, but I picked up a small roll and decided to put that around the base first. So after pulling off all the boards we had put on the day before, we started with wrapping the bottom with the ice and water shield I had picked up. This stuff was not flexible at all, and if you didn't start at the right angle from the beginning, there was really no correcting it. Since I just needed to cover the bottom 2 feet and the wrap was 3 feet wide, we just went with it and it worked out alright, and we trimmed away the excess after. This stuff is basically a thick self-adhesive tar paper. It wasn't very fun to work with, but at least we only needed to do 1 layer. Next was the house wrap. This stuff was much easier to put up. I have to say I did pick up one of those hammer tackers for stapling on the wrap, and that made the process so much easier than doing it with just a standard tacker or stapler. Kind of like roofing, you start at the bottom and just overlap each layer on top of the previous layer by about 6 inches or so. I also made sure to tape the tops and sides of each layer good before getting the next layer up. You do want to keep the bottom of each layer of the wrap open, don't tape it, so that the water can drain and escape and not get trapped in the wrap. The way I understand this stuff to work is that you're basically creating a path for any water or moisture that gets behind your siding to make its way down and out instead of absorbing into whatever is behind it. Once the wrapping was up, I could cut out and tape the openings. I picked up plenty of rolls of flashing tape for this. This stuff is a super thick and sticky tape that forms a totally waterproof barrier. I started with putting it on the sills for each opening, then I put it up the side jambs, and then I made sure all the center moles of the framing between the windows and panels were also wrapped fully with the flashing tape. Okay, I finally felt good about putting that siding on. Since I had already cut the bottom boards and some trim, I was a little nervous about putting those back up and getting them to fit right. Thankfully, it went really smoothly and everything fit exactly how it did before. I started installing the metal siding next. This was really my first go around with installing these metal sheets as siding, so I'm by no means an expert. There were basically two trim pieces I used. One was what's called a J-channel, which I really used to trim out most everything. And then there was a bottom trim piece where the metal siding would transition to the horizontal oak boards at the bottom of the coop. It definitely takes some figuring out how to use tin snips to cut the trim pieces to get the right fit and look for them going in, but nothing was that overly complicated. Again, it just all took time and went slow since it was new to me. For things like a window, I started with the bottom J-channel piece, then the sides, then the final piece as somewhat of a top cap. The J-channels were nice because what they did was hide your cut edges once you start putting up your metal sheets. Putting up the metal panels on the sides of the coop was pretty straightforward since they were really just big rectangles. The front and back sides of the coop got more complicated with that top angle along with the window cutouts. For cutting the metal siding pieces, I used an angle grinder with a metal cutting wheel. Definitely make sure you get a few extra of those cutting wheels. You can go through them quickly and you always want to have a backup on hand. One thing I'll mention is that on the front and back side with that angled roof, I started with the tall end of the siding, and it can definitely go easier if you start with the shorter end first. That way, when you're working with the triangle pieces at the top, you're always sliding into that triangle the proper way. I didn't do that and started at the taller end at first and got myself into a tricky situation with fitting in the final siding piece on the back side of the coop. Something I learned in the process is that you can actually bend those J-channel pieces outward, slide in your metal siding, and then bend the trim back afterwards. That was sort of a plan B and not ideal, but I did find myself needing to do it a couple times when pieces fit in tight. Last was putting in the corner pieces, which thankfully fit in pretty well. Again, I wouldn't say I did all the siding by the book, but overall I was really happy with how it turned out and love how the white siding looks mixed with the wood accents. With the siding and trim up, it was time to start moving on to the door and panels and then the windows. To build the front door and air vents, I started with fastening the tongue and groove boards I had previously finished to the plywood backing. Instead of fastening by nailing into the tongue like you'd normally do, I just clamped all the boards together, squared them up on the plywood panel, and screwed them in on the face of the board along the perimeter. The screw heads would just get covered up with the oak trim boards anyways, so that was the easiest way to go. Next was the oak trim. I really just ripped those 6-inch oak fence boards in half so they were about 3 inches wide and used those to trim out the panels, fastening them down with the same gold-coated premium screws. I added a diagonal bar on each panel for that traditional farm look. I really like the look of how these turned out. Some of those oak boards that you get have more of the lighter tones of white oak, and some seem to look more like red oak. These had more of the red tones and didn't contrast the darker boards behind them as much as I thought they would, but the boards will turn gray over time and should develop a nice contrast then. Now, I could have applied the outdoor defense oil on all the oak for this project too, and probably should have for them to last as long as possible, but mainly due to time and just needing to keep moving on the project, I opted not to right now. I can always apply some later to the boards and trim if needed, but this wood usually does hold up pretty well to the elements, and a decent amount of it will be under the roof, which will block some of the precipitation from hitting it. My mom and daughter also cleaned all the windows we'd be installing, so those looked great and were ready to go in when we got to it. They also helped get the window openings ready to start putting windows into. We cut 2x4s for the jambs on the inside of the framing and installed those, and that would be what the windows would sit up against. And then we put some foam weather stripping on the face of the window jambs so they'd have a weather-tight seal once installed. We also put a strip of the foam weather seal on the sill boards that the windows would sit on to lift them off the framing a bit and give them some extra cushion. Okay, the panels were all built and it was time to get them installed. My dad came back to help with this since those panels ended up being really heavy, way more so than I thought they'd be. First we needed to put in the jambs that the air vents and door would close up against. 2x4s ripped down in half were perfect for this, and I just screwed those in for each of the openings. To install the air vents, we just hoisted up the panels and used some shims to get the gaps around each one as even as possible. I fastened the hardware with more of those gold screws. I also made sure to get the heavy-duty exterior grade hinges for the doors and panels since I knew they were so hefty. For the door, I used 3 of those hinges, top, middle, and bottom. We took a little extra time to get the gaps around the door just right and make sure everything was properly aligned. It went in great and operates super smooth. Then it was time to start putting the windows in. Since we had already gotten the jambs and weather stripping in for those earlier, they were pretty much ready to go. I just needed to cut the oak trim pieces for the outside to secure the windows in place. I put in the bottom sill piece first and cut those a little wider so they had a slight overhang. Then the side and top trim pieces went in afterward and ended up being between 2 and 2.5 inches depending on how things fit. The windows really went in super well, and I love the old antique farmhouse look they give. With the air vents up, the next thing was to put in kickstands so those can be opened up for airflow on warm days. My initial plan, which seemed easy and like a sure thing, totally didn't work. I mounted the hinge on the bottom jamb for the panel, but then the vents wouldn't close. I totally should have seen that coming. So on to plan B, which was a little more complex, but I knew this would work. I had to cut an opening for the kickstand to fit into on the framing on the back of the panel. Then I could mount the hinge on the panel itself, and it would just tuck up alongside the back of the vent panel when not in use. This worked great. At the bottom of the kickstand, I made a little bird mouth cut so that it really locked onto the jamb of the opening where it would rest. I believe I made the kickstands 24 inches long. I figured I could always cut them shorter if needed later, but this seemed like an appropriate size for now to open it up. Now behind the panels, I did go in and install 1/2-inch hardware cloth for predator proofing. You could do chicken wire, but I always recommend using hardware cloth whenever possible. I really like a nice tight hardware cloth install, and I've put in enough of it now to learn some tips. First, you need a straight line to start. If you don't start straight, it's really hard to correct as you go. So I started by stapling in the bottom row. After the bottom was in, then I did the middle row, which is the next step. Anytime you're putting it in, you want to make sure to put as much tension on the hardware cloth as possible as you go. So in this case, I'm pulling up as I install it. Then I work toward each of the top corners, doing small sections at a time, flip-flopping between the sides and top. The key here to get a really tight fit is to pull the hardware cloth slightly away from the wood framing and then shoot your staple at an angle. That way the staple catches the hardware cloth and pulls it toward the outside edge of the area you're installing it. This stretches the hardware cloth and gives it a really tight, springy fit. If you have an air compressor, getting a narrow crown stapler is the way to go. You'll get so much better of a final product using this than anything else. I believe I used 1/2-inch staples, so they're in there really good and secure. Next was the flooring. And again, this is one of the most important parts of an Eggmobile. You want as open a floor as possible to allow chicken poop to pass through to the ground below, but you also want it tight enough to keep predators out. I was literally at the hardware store looking at every kind of fencing and panel available, talking to my farmer friend who had built an Eggmobile himself on the phone, trying to figure out the right option. He had used expanded metal on his coop, which didn't work as well as he wanted it to, and he said he was seriously considering just using chicken wire since the opening should be big enough. I didn't really like the idea of chicken wire and was going to try and avoid going that route. But then I had the thought that they do make a 1-inch by 1-inch hardware cloth, even though they didn't carry it at any of our local farm or hardware stores locally. So I went home and ordered some online, and unfortunately the only size I could get in the 4-foot width that I wanted was in this giant 100-foot roll. The thing I wasn't sure about with the hardware cloth was if it would be substantial enough to handle people foot traffic on top of it. What surprised me though with the 1-inch hardware cloth versus the 1/2-inch was that it was actually a heavier gauge wire and seemed much beefier. My plan was to get the hardware cloth installed and see how it did. If it didn't seem like that alone would be enough, I had some extra cattle panels I figured I could put on top of the hardware cloth that would make it plenty sturdy for foot traffic. But I only wanted to do that if needed. So I went to work stapling in the 1-inch hardware cloth. Now this was not at all as easy as I thought it would be. I thought putting it on the floor horizontally would be a breeze, but I think because it was a heavier gauge, it was just a lot harder to work with and especially to keep tensioned. But I did the best I could and got it in fine. I did fold up the sides 1 inch around the edges so that the hardware cloth could be closed up tight around the perimeter so there weren't any openings for predators to get through. The 4-foot widths did overlap some through the middle, but this was fine since the 2x10 plank would go over that in the center of the coop. After making sure it was thoroughly stapled down, I was happy with how the flooring turned out. After walking on it a bit, I decided that just the hardware cloth would be fine and to not install the cattle panel on top. For an adult, you wouldn't want to walk directly on the hardware cloth where it's unsupported, but walking on the joists was totally fine. I'm hoping it will hold up fine as is, but it wouldn't be too hard to put in some extra reinforcement down the road if needed. while I was installing the flooring, Joelle was cutting and installing more of the foam weather stripping so that those panels and the door would close up nice and tight. And last was putting in the center 2x10 plank. I did this with the bigger GRK screws. I believe they were the 4-inchers. We were finally in the final stages of finishing out the inside of the coop. We had a rainy morning, so I took the opportunity to stay inside and build the hen gear nesting box we picked up. It was definitely nice to get to this stage and not have a whole other mini project of needing to build our own nesting box. Plus, I really like this design and how it keeps the eggs clean, and the box itself is easy to clean out when needed. Putting it together wasn't hard either. It took me a little over an hour to build. You basically just hand tighten everything up as you go and then give it all a final tightening in the end. It's definitely a well thought out design and well constructed product. My only thing I wish they were a bit clearer on was some of their installation details and dimensions. I couldn't find the height of the boxes listed anywhere, so I actually did reach out to the company and ask what size my opening needed to be for the box to fit into with my framing. They let me know 20 inches, so that's the height I framed it to, which the box is 20 inches high, so it would technically fit, but that didn't account for the mounting brackets that the box hangs from, which added about an additional 2.5 inches of height I would have needed to add onto my framed opening for it to slide in properly. It wasn't a big deal in the end. I was still able to install the hangers they provided on the face of the framing fine, and it fit great. But it didn't fit into the framed opening like I had initially planned. Either way, I'm super excited about this nesting box. Hen Gear recommends setting it at 30 inches off the ground, but I put ours at 24 inches and I think that will work well. I didn't want it too high, especially since our kids are our main egg collectors. I mentioned earlier there was a couple reasons we put the collection box on the inside versus the outside. The big one was that since mobile coops are raised up so high off the ground, it would have been high even for me to collect eggs on the outside, let alone our kids. The other main reason was for the winter time. It just seemed to make sense to keep the eggs on the inside to hopefully keep them from freezing really quickly. We don't mind having a reason to go into the coop regularly and check on things. You just never know what might be going on inside a coop. So we're happy with having the inside collection box for now.
Yeah.
All right. One more thing. Wow, so fancy.
Now you are sealed in the hyperbolic chamber.
Oh man, that's amazing.
Alright.
Let's do it to it.
Next, I installed the Chick Cozy chicken door on the side of the coop. This door really was the easiest part of the whole project. I first figured out where I wanted the door to sit on the coop. Then I drilled some small pilot holes through the siding and plywood to make sure it lined up on the inside where I wanted it. It looked good, so I traced out the rectangle I needed to cut out, which was 8¼ inches by 10¼ inches, I believe. Then I used a circular saw to make the straight cuts and finished off the corners with an oscillating multi-tool.
Alright, moment of truth.
Pop right out.
Boom.
From there I just lined up the door and poked some small holes with a screw where the 4 mounting holes were. I drilled a small pilot hole at each, and then I screwed in the 4 stainless steel mounting screws that came with the door. It fit great. I honestly wasn't quite sure where I was going to install the solar controller. You can't install it on either side of the door since the door is open on each side. Then I realized I could center it right on top of the door, and that was definitely the way to go. It fit perfectly, and it actually makes sense to have the controller up higher for accessing it. Then I just ran the extra wiring down below the coop and secured it with a little electrical conduit clip so that it was tight and out of the way. This door has really been working great for us, and I really think it can be a worthwhile investment on any chicken coop. The last thing I built was the roosting bars. I don't know why these gave me a run for my money, but they did. I tried a different design for them initially that was overthinking it and way too complex. Then I just decided to do 2 straight 2x4s up at an angle on each side and cut little 8-inch 2x4 blocks that the roost bars would sit on. This turned out great. I think I spaced them between 14 to 16 inches apart, and each of the 8 roost bars are 6 feet long. So far the spacing seems to be working. And I like that the bars are there as something solid for you to hold on to as you're walking down the center plank or maneuvering in the coop. So then the question is, what did this Eggmobile, chicken coop on wheels, mobile coop, whatever you want to call it, cost? Here's a basic spreadsheet breakdown that shows that it all costed around $4,750. That used running gear was $800, which was a really great deal given its condition. The windows were actually the biggest bargain on the whole project. I paid $3 each for those windows and used $5 on the coop. Hardware and supplies totaled nearly $1,200. A few hundred of that alone was probably in screws and fasteners, which I went through a lot of. Plus all the heavy-duty hinges, all the weather stripping tape, all that stuff was not cheap, and I used a lot of it along the way. The hardware cloth was also in there. Lumber, over $1,600. It was a pretty sizable structure in the end, so those costs for the lumber just added up. I think I used around 25 or so of those 16-foot oak boards, and those totaled around $500 of that. The metal siding and roof was relatively affordable for the project, just over $500. And then the cost of the chicken door and nesting boxes, which yes, they're an upfront investment, but I think both those things are quality and will save us time in the long run. So I wouldn't exactly call this a budget-friendly project in the end. There are a lot of ways you could have kept costs down on this one. You could have found used metal siding for siding the whole thing. There's lots of that out there. Or they make plywood siding boards for exterior use that could have kept costs down too. Even just assembling things with nails versus screws might have saved a couple $100. While budget has driven many of our projects in the past, that's not necessarily what we set out for on this one. We wanted something that looked as nice as it was built, and I definitely think this will be a worthwhile investment for our homestead for years to come.